Well, good afternoon, everybody. Let's get started. We have some great speakers and discussion, so I don't want to waste any more time allowing other people to join. So welcome from Washington, D.C. Thank you all for joining us. My name is Christopher Klaich, and I am the Director of Policy for the Chamber of Digital Commerce and their national security work covering illicit finance, AML, sanctions, and geopolitics. We all know the digital assets industry, encompassing cryptocurrencies, tokens, and various blockchain-based assets, presents unique AML challenges. And these challenges have been highlighted in the focus that senior members of Congress have given to these issues, most notably, of course, Senator Warren and her continuous public statements on the subject, and also very, very notably in the aftermath of the October 7th attacks on Israel. This focus has been self-reinforcing, and attention has grown so that many more senators and representatives in Congress on both sides of the aisle are now speaking about and introducing bills that cover these issues. So addressing these questions is crucial for the continued growth and legitimacy of the industry, as well as ensuring that it can thrive while mitigating the risks that money laundering and other illicit activities pose to it. With that as context, I'm excited to have three extremely experienced and nuanced voices on these topics here to share with us. I'd like to introduce them. Marina Kostova, she's the CEO of Crystal Blockchain, which is a blockchain analytics firm. Carol House is executive in residence at TerraNet Ventures and the former director of cybersecurity and secure digital innovation at the National Security Council in the White House. She also has extensive experience at FinCEN. And finally, we have Jeremy Sheridan with us. He leads FTI Consulting's blockchain investigations practice and is the former assistant director at the SES level in the Office of Investigations at the U.S. Secret Service. So thank you all for joining us for this discussion. And I know this short description of your experience doesn't encompass all that you guys have done, so please share more about that if it's relevant to any of the questions that we talk about today. And also, for everybody listening in, thank you for joining again. Please share questions in the chat, and we will hopefully have around 10 minutes at the end to address some of them. So that said, let's just jump in with some questions. As we all know, I think we probably have mostly an American audience on this, although we may have some folks overseas. But in the U.S., we recently have seen Senators Lummis and Haggerty introduce a bill that would foster public-private coordination to combat on-chain illicit finance. But what do you think are the most outstanding issues to improve a public-private partnership in combating illicit finance? And what are the best practices for monitoring transactions and suspicious activities? I know that's been a point of contention of the industry's involvement and support to government and to regulators and to law enforcement. So Marina, perhaps you can kick us off and talk through some of those issues.
Yeah, absolutely. Happy to. And of course, it's an excellent example of the call for the private-public cooperation. And that's definitely something that is, very much has a lot, room to improve. And we, as a company that provides blockchain analytics services to our customers, we can see among our customers that are distributed globally, also based in the United States and in Europe, we can see a lot of, again, room for improvement that could make them much active, players in this space, much active contributors to the ongoing, especially cross-border investigation cases. What are the issues, what are from the top of my head? I would say that, first of all, it's a clarity on the deployed compliance framework, because we can see that many organizations are still, for example, not filing as many SARs as they should. They are sometimes hesitating to respond in time to the calls for cooperation, especially if those are cross-border calls. And that itself, again, is critical because money launderers that are dealing with digital assets know that speed is an essence, and you really need to, you can go away if you're moving fast enough. So I would say that not enough policies around the speed of response, about the way this response should be happening, about the amount of effort that should be put into the investigations. These are critical issues. Part of the problem I see is that for new businesses, that are establishing and start dealing with digital assets, I can see them organizing a compliance team that's a default, but they don't frequently have investigation teams working with them, and that's a must. And you also need, of course, to train them and to make sure that they are aware of all the new developments there are in this space. So yeah, and there's still for the whole industry, with the United States, it's an ideal example for the call of cooperation. But still, again, the next question would be like, who's authorized to have access to such groups, of companies exchanging information, and how the case triage is going to be happening in a more automated way when we're going to see a growth of cases, growth of the volume of transactions, and how are we going to be dealing with the cross-border investigation cases?
What, so it sounds like there are several avenues that can use improvement, partnership, closer coordination, nationally and internationally, information sharing in an effective and quick way so that we can act and law enforcement can act on useful information. And Carol, I'm curious, I know that you've dealt with many of these issues at the policy and sort of regulatory level. And I'm curious, I know we've had some discussions in the past, but you were involved in ransomware issues in your time in government, and the illicit virtual asset network, I know, was born out of a ransomware push, but do you see that as having legs to be able to address some of these issues, to be broadened in scope and hopefully help share information?
Goodness, I certainly hope so. And I absolutely love Marina's points. And I know that Jeremy cares a lot about info sharing since he drove a lot of that when he was at Secret Service and continues to message it. Yes, the IVAN, or Illicit Virtual Asset Notification Partnership, was something that was driven and really birthed out of the U.S. counter ransomware campaign when I was at the National Security Council, which included many different prongs, including international partnerships, as well as disruption, defense, and then looking to specifically address the illicit finance angles related to ransomware, since ransomware is inherently a cybercrime and a financial crime, which is true with so much cybercrime, actually. But with crypto, I'm very hopeful about the IVAN partnership, but also others. So IVAN, while it's created and it's really driven by the NCIJTF, which, if you're not familiar with that acronym, don't worry, I'll spell it out for you. The National Cyber Investigative Joint Task Force, which is chaired by the FBI. And they've really been driving this partnership to enable government sharing with key industry partners to be able to detect as well as interdict illicit virtual asset flows. But that's only one piece. There's also things like 314B information sharing and liability protections that are given under illicit finance regimes, as well as cyber info sharing under the Cybersecurity Information Sharing Act. I think so often with illicit cryptocurrency flows, there's potentially two levels of liability protection that have been given to industry that can enable them to share information without fear of civil litigation. But the real issue that we're facing is actually putting this into practice. I don't see that much more focused on policy that's needed on the sharing of info. There's a few policy fixes that I would like, including expansion of liability protections under things like 314B to cover financial service providers and not just financial institutions, given the fact that financial service providers like analytics firms are often some of the first ones to see and detect broader money laundering activity instead of just the financial institutions. That would give some parity to 314B with the Cyber Info Sharing Act provisions. But the reality is that there's a lot that industry could be doing that's not currently happening. And I feel the same way for government. And there are wonderful people on both sides that are trying work. IVAN is a great example, as well as the crypto ISAC that's currently being stood up. I'm excited about someone standing that up. The crypto space really hasn't generally joined things like the financial services or the IT ISAC. So in the absence of that, if they want to create their own partnership, that's the sort of thing that I would encourage. I think what we need is just more prioritization. The issue that Marina really hit on, needing to actually prioritize and do it, sharing of the information, and proving out the benefit of having criminals, for some reason, choose to launder on public ledgers. Not sure why they're doing that, but delighted that they are. I hope they keep doing it. And I think that enabling the kind of automated detection and information sharing that these systems uniquely can permit, but that the sector hasn't evolved in a timely enough manner, in my view, I think that those are the kinds of things that I'm really hopeful for. All of those need to be matched with the international issues that Marina also spoke to, being able to trace that assets have gone to some, alphanumeric string and public address isn't as useful when there isn't an identity to attach it to. So that long talking point that at Treasury we messaged about the need for jurisdictions to adopt the international standards for crypto. Most jurisdictions still have not, 5 years after we have adopted the virtual asset standards, have still not adopted them. So we need a targeted campaign driven with, it can be industry efforts and public-private partnerships for capacity building, but also driven by government on the most priority jurisdictions where they face either the biggest political will issues, where the most egregious violators are, or where capacity issues are, to grow that capacity in a timely manner, because that's not what we're seeing right now.
Gosh, well, Carol, there are about 5 or 6 rabbit holes that we could dive down that you mentioned, and I think the one point that I thought is interesting that you said is, you as an expert that's seen these issues from multiple standpoints in government are still saying we would love silly criminals and bad actors to continue to use an open ledger to document their nefarious activity. I think that's something that's either lost or not completely understood on a lot of people that don't know the technology very, very well, and is a point that some of the detractors in Congress, for example, don't allow for or don't acknowledge. But in terms of putting some of these existing frameworks into practice, or more effective practice, do you see that as a lack of resources that some government agencies have to actually lean into these frameworks that are sort of in their nascent existence or nascent state?
Absolutely. Resourcing has been a big issue. And I appreciate the point that you made before. I agree that I think that there's a lack of understanding of the benefit across some places about public ledgers. It's also not a panacea for everything. People that say that, well, because it's public, there shouldn't have to be other controls, I also don't agree with. But I know that you take us, certainly the people on this webinar, take a more nuanced approach. I think that resourcing and prioritization has been a big issue. Most agencies have not been funded to even the level of the president's budget for many, many years. And I mean, agencies like FinCEN haven't even been resourced, I think, to their authorized level just for the Anti-Money Laundering Act generally, much less to meet necessarily the need for us to be able to scale our capacity for disruption of illicit finance. When you look at enforcement and other actions and investigations in this space, the timeliness of them, given the scope and scale and pace of growth in the cryptocurrency industry, if you have enforcement actions come 3 to 6 years after the fact, is that a scale or a speed that we find satisfying? I think that underscores the need for certainly law enforcement to continue, but for it to be prioritized and resourced, but also for those public-private partnerships that can enable more timely, real-time interdiction, like we have in non-crypto activities like the Rapid Response Program and the Financial Fraud Kill Chain. These are models that we've shown and demonstrated the benefits from. We should be able to replicate those, especially in a space where there's so much information that's public.
Yeah, and it's really allows the problems to compound when you have to wait 3 or multiple more years to address some of these issues. So in some of these cases, the platforms have grown to be much bigger than they would have been when some action could have been taken years earlier. And I think I have a solution for the resourcing that Bitcoiners would really appreciate. We just turn on the money printer and that'll send the dollars wherever we need them. It's a joke, everybody. So Jeremy, sort of touching on some of the issues that Carol spoke about, it's a common trope in the industry that changes happen so quickly that it's difficult, even people that are steeped in it, to keep up with things. So how do you think that AML frameworks can be made flexible and adaptive to keep pace with the rapidly changing environment?
Yeah, Chris, thanks for having me. Carol, Marina, great to be with you. I think Marina and Carol hit on a ton of great points. I want to start, and you referenced it, Chris, and Carol hit on it, that we're talking about digital assets and criminality, which I think is part of the problem. It's often framed from that perspective, not suggesting that we're doing it here, but as we are aware that Treasury and every data point out there acknowledges that money laundering, proliferation financing, terrorist financing, illicit activity commonly occurs in traditional and using fiat assets. So it's part of the challenge is that just philosophical debate that we're battling against. But the way I frame it to respond to your question about flexibility is in enforcement, in a regulatory, and in a legislative sense. I think from the enforcement perspective, we're very far along in our ability to respond, to react, to investigate. I think there is a recognition of digital assets as an investigative and source of probable cause and indicia of crime that is unrivaled, as Carol and you've indicated. I think from regulatory frameworks, part of the challenge we face is, I know the common mantra is regulatory clarity. Having worked in the industry and private sector in a crypto custodian, I always was challenged by regulatory efficiency. Regulatory frameworks have been in existence surrounding the industry since 2013. State and federal level requirements, they are overlapping, they're complex. They deal with multiple agencies, IRS, FinCEN, SEC, CFTC, and others. And that's just domestically, as Carol hit on and Marina hit on. You know, you're also dealing with travel rules, FATF guidelines, money transmission licenses. They make establishing businesses and building businesses in the United States very, very difficult, which leads to, in my opinion, a lack of familiarity, compliance gaps, regulatory gaps, openings for illicit activity to occur. And I think underpinning all of it is the lack of legislative advancement or codification and establishment of laws and frameworks around this to encourage businesses and bring businesses in. The industry is at a position of disadvantage, largely because it's always framed as a tool solely for criminal purposes. As Ari Redford very astutely points out, that crypto is a tool, crime is crime, crypto is crypto. No more than I-95 is a tool to get from north to south, despite the fact that it's used to run drugs from north to south. No one suggests we're going to outlaw I-95. So overcoming that philosophical debate is a challenge. Overcoming the use case argument is a challenge. And I think those two jockey legislatively, depending on what's occurring in the world. Obviously, with recent events, as you referenced on October 7th, the criminal AML terrorist financing discussion is very, very prominent and important. I'm in no way suggesting that these types of criminal activities need to go unnoticed or undealt with. And so I think it's important to be, as you say, how do we be flexible on that? We have to, from within industry, from those who have the knowledge base around the technology and around how it's applied, bring that to a legislative discussion and implementation. I think there's a lot of good examples of that that have been displayed recently. The most recent one from Reddick, Moser, and Gilman surrounding classifying DeFi protocols as critical infrastructure to provide the necessary frameworks and entities around them. They suggest using Treasury OSIP. They suggest using coordination of information through law enforcement, other critical infrastructure protection agencies like CISA, as Carol suggested, the ISACs to share information, and even establishing a new entity around what they call critical communications transmitters that will create a more secure environment that will have additional requirements placed upon them for geolocation blocking, wallet monitoring, wallet risk scoring, and oversight by government entities such as FinCEN that will have to be given new authorities, but will have the authority to officially and legally regulate within the space to make it a more secure environment, to make it more recognizable when illicit activity is occurring, so that it's not within the overall ecosystem of an unregulated or lack of legal foundation type of platform.
Touching on what you said, and the need for regulatory clarity, I thought it was pretty interesting and telling that yesterday Secretary Yellen pretty much point blank spoke at the hearing in the Financial Services Committee in the House and said, like I said, point blank, that we do need regulation. We're looking for Congress to pass legislation to help us regulate this industry. So, and one other note that I heard from her was she also mentioned digital wallets and the need to have protection for consumers around digital wallets and the risks that unwitting consumers have in using digital wallets. So I thought that that was also an interesting kind of wrinkle to the regulatory viewpoint that government is taking to kind of step beyond some of the issues that have been in discussion already. But you use the analogy of I-95, a highway here running up the East Coast to mule and move drugs. And I think that gets at the crux of an issue that the industry has and sort of a debate between regulators and government and enforcement and the industry, that analogy that we're transferring information and we're not regulating phone lines, communication lines, or moving, shutting down I-95 because drugs are pushed, or even say human trafficking, humans being moved up and down the coast. Carol, I'm curious if what your viewpoint is on that. I know there's a debate between the industry and maybe you can highlight what you see as a difference or a flaw in that from a regulator's point of view.
Yeah, I really appreciate the metaphor, and thank you, Chris. I know you and I have had a chat about this, and I'm so curious what Marina, as the CEO of a platform, will have to say. So I appreciate that, and also the paper, by the brilliant Rebecca and Mike, whom I know well and respect. The fundamental issue that I see as a policy wonk and non-lawyer and a cyber person is that first, it's not an either or, it's an and. Basically, but essentially, like, the infrastructure that's created here, when it's financial, is like information transfer is different from value transfer. And ultimately, when we've created rails that are now fundamental and specifically provide and enable the cross-border transfer instantaneously of significant value, that is, first off, I would say that it's already critical infrastructure. It's not an if, it does meet the definition, in my view, of the financial services sector, one of the 16 critical infrastructure sectors, and why in the DeFi report that the CFTC Technology Advisory Committee that I chair, a report that we just drafted and adopted and submitted to the CFTC, we highlighted that non-financial regulatory regimes that are currently coming into place probably are going to apply to DeFi. For example, critical infrastructure providers are going to be subject to certain cyber incident reporting obligations under the CERCIA legislation that CISA, our cyber agency, is currently administering and working on. I feel that is already something that I don't imagine that in any way that this infrastructure would be carved out. I also feel that anything that would be covered as an infrastructure as a service provider might also be covered by the infrastructure as a service notice of proposed rulemaking that Commerce just published. They did an ANPRM back in 2021, and it's all pursuant to an executive order that was issued under Trump and maintained under Biden and emphasized again in the AIEO. I know I've said a lot of acronyms there, but basically just this requirement to impose KYC obligations on infrastructure providers. I think that likely covers all of these, but by my read of the definitions, I don't see how they're carved out, except maybe whether or not U.S. entities or persons. That will be really interesting to see how they do or do not apply. I'm very curious, but ultimately, I feel that there just is a distinction, and no matter whether it's existing under ongoing rulemaking or something else, value transfer just is different than information transfer. And the obligations have to be different, because when you do business in a high value, high risk sector, then you have the obligation of being able to meet certain requirements. I do think that in that case, if you are some entity or institution, that it would be very likely that you would be covered, and you should be under statutes like the Big Secrecy Act. That doesn't mean that I think that it's a one size fits all. People that play at the network layer, I don't see as providing the same kind of functional activity that money services businesses and crypto exchanges do. So the obligation should be different. Right now, I would say that it's possible that basically they're not covered under the BSA, but they are covered potentially under IEPA, our sanctions regime, in which case I think that anyone who operates at those layers who's a US person should think very hard about whether or not they're providing material support to a prohibited transaction. So I basically, those are a lot of other regimes that I think could potentially apply here, but essentially it just is me emphasizing that when it's financial, when it's operating as financial infrastructure, the financial regulators are going to be interested, and there's going to be a need to ensure necessary controls to protect consumers and the financial system from critical risks. I think it will be really interesting where that infrastructure isn't financial, and then what kinds of controls are or not put in place where they truly are functioning more as non-financial infrastructure, in which case all the fun issues under the information technology and communication sectors, where CISA is the sector-specific agency, will be really interesting. So the fact that these technologies can support both, I think, is where some of the really interesting policy and tech solutions may come to play.
And thinking through that, the analogies that people make, I think one thing that is also maybe lost in that is that you cannot instantly zip, 10 tons of cocaine from Colombia, somewhere in South America, to New York City instantly and have all the 3 days of travel or whatever it is, the opportunity interdicted up along the way. Whereas with this value transfer, you can zip any amount of value instantly anywhere in the world. And so that's something I think that's also potentially lost in that sort of discussion that both, well, certainly government already, I think, is appreciates, but some people, I think, potentially in the industry don't appreciate sometimes. So
you're totally right. Sort of how crypto and DeFi is different from cash. Like one takes time and space and physics to move from point A to point B, and the other is instantaneous or nearly instantaneous. And then the discussions about what does interdiction and detection potentially look like. Great point.
Yeah, and just touching on the international aspect, Marina, we know that the on and off ramps ultimately are the best places to apprehend funds, to seize funds, and to be sure that it doesn't fall into the accounts of North Korea, other enemies of the West, Iran, and others. So do you see any ways that we can strengthen that international coordination to try to lock down those endpoints? Groups like people like the Lazarus Group and even Cash for crypto operations in the UAE and Russia?
Yeah, of course. And it's for us, it's a key question actually, because again, from my position, I see the biggest risk for people who are battling crime around the world is in cross-border transactions that are happening instantaneously, and because it takes so much time for countries to talk to each other, for law enforcement to talk to each other, for investigation teams from different jurisdictions to communicate. Money launderers are walking away, or they are successful at proceeding further with the stolen funds. So I would say that everything that speeds up this communication, everything that brings trained personnel under particular, again, SLAs and internal policies that jurisdictions can agree on, that is really, really, really required. And I'm using the word SLA because I'm thinking about this exactly in this fashion. It's really something that I would love to see participants of the market agree on. That again, there is a compliance team and investigation team responding to certain requests in a certain fashion, and in as fast as possible. And that, of course, requires, I understand that perfectly, that requires, of course, extra efforts, extra costs, on compliance, and especially under the notion that we are going to see the explosion of the number of the transactions on many blockchains, and L2s are here. So the volume of the transactions, the number, the volume of the activity is going to grow. The complexity of that is going to grow, and that's going to pose a significant challenge of how are we keeping up with all of that without, again, growing costs for compliance, to the moon. So that's really a big challenge. But yeah. That's the key thing. Training is not a small thing, I must say. And Carol mentioned that that's also a big problem on the level of the various supervisory bodies, to be funded to actually conduct investigations, but also, I assume, to keep people actually informed, about what's going on. And because new things are emerging every time. And bad actors, they're spending 24/7 just inventing, what they can do. Like we are spending 24/7, figuring out how to outrace them.
And I know, when we have willing partners with allies and allied nations, the issues of coordination and education and capacity building, they're solvable and resolvable issues. But when you have an unwilling partner or an adversary,
yeah,
are there opportunities, ways to, maybe other than kinetically or potentially kinetically, do you have any novel ideas of how we align with Russia? Or the UAE is really generally a partner of the US in most instances, but there are cash for crypto operations that are reported happening in Dubai. Like how can we influence them or lean on them to stop that? Or
yeah, that's quite a complicated question about like how to cooperate if there is a need to cooperate, and how to get information and correct information about what's going on, and when that's really a huge question. And I have seen cases of collaboration that were happening again, where there was like a common goal to, for example, close certain dark marketplaces, and that was very clear, but unfortunately, like in the last years, I see less and less of that. That is very much true. That in many situations, again, enforcement units are like on their own. Like, and we are becoming a centerpiece also in these situations, because we are trying to get as much data as possible and not making a decision, but actually providing insights that are leading to particular decisions or particular conclusions. And in these cases, it's critical to be sure that the data that is being used is correctly interpreted. And that is where a lot of effort should be put, not just, again, jumping to conclusions immediately, but actually spending more time on actually understanding how the bigger picture looks like. So we're having a director of blockchain intelligence who loves to use the analogy with one of the South Park cartoons, where there is a potential profit of stealing underpants, and there is a question of like, how do you actually make a profit from that? So it's like a same story. Like, okay, we can see illicit activity happening in the realm of digital assets. That's one thing, but how exactly these digital assets are actually being transformed into fiat currency, and through which entities, and through what actually what are the paths that is being taken for that. So it's very important to look at that holistically, and not only like focus ourselves only onto the crypto. And I think that's something that the industry is teaching itself to do, how to observe everything. And even if the traditional financial institutions that are not touching crypto, that doesn't mean that they should not be a part of these ongoing, again, discussions and reviews, and they should not contribute to what they understand to this narrative.
Jeremy, Carol, do you guys have any thoughts on that topic as well?
Yeah, or Carol, please, if.
Yeah, no, well, I'm so curious about your insights coming from Secret Service. I'm sure you have thoughts, but I love Marina's vision of a holistic look. It's totally right that it's all part of an ecosystem, and at least the benefit of where some of those like fiat conversions are happening is that, like, typically, at least right now, while it's not inevitable, that is what most criminals want to be able to do, either now or eventually, once they feel confident that they can get their assets out and they've successfully laundered their assets. Because at least right now, crypto is not at scale adopted in exchange for goods and services. That may not be the future inevitably. So I don't think that only focusing on the on and off ramps works forever, but it can be extremely effective, and ultimately how helpful it can be with those institutions where the fiat conversion is happening, and that generally are where more compliance exists internationally, can be extremely helpful. So I think that's a wonderful insight from Marina.
Yeah, I completely agree. I also, Carol referenced my Secret Service background. If I'm going to do a threat assessment on the vulnerabilities here, I think collectively we need to look at what is the goal in terms of what we're trying to protect. And these are all overlapping and they're not mutually exclusive or singular in nature, but there's a national security, there's a crime prevention, there's a financial safety and soundness, there's a consumer and investor protection, there's a financial stability element to all of this. And they all have, I think, somewhat nuanced approaches. There'll be a collective blanket over them, but there are differences in how you would approach to protect and steel against those types of threats. You have to look at a lot of what the threat actor, who the threat actor is. Marina hit on a lot of it. These are transnational organized criminal groups that utilize crime as a service models. They conduct coordinated activities simultaneously in multiple jurisdictions. They're highly organized, hierarchical business model type approaches. We used to say, we weren't competing against individual actors in law enforcement. We were competing against the Steve Jobs or the Bill Gates of the criminal world because of their level of organization, compartmentalization, and discipline as it approaches criminal activity. Geography, of course, is a huge factor in terms of non-extradition or dealing with individuals in countries that either offer safe haven, encouragement, material support, and even outright employment to execute these crimes. And as Marina said, they're early adopters of technology. They have unlimited budgets, and unfortunately, they're starting to increasingly using cryptos as tools of national power for control, surveillance, censorship, and manipulation. So we are up against a very, very competent and strong adversary. But that doesn't mean that we can't. My opinion is fighting without it is very difficult. It will be difficult to get reach into a lot of those areas and to address the actors where they are, even if they were individuals, and in most cases, in a lot of cases, they are state level or organized elements. So we have to rely on innovation. We have to rely on strengthening internal systems. We have to do innovation from within. And that runs the gamut of company leadership and management to investing more in security teams, developers and technical staff, better partnership with third-party services and so forth, and providing law enforcement with additional tools. I do think part of the problem that law enforcement faces, and I certainly faced in the Secret Service, was the limitations we had once we knew where the assets were, the illicit gains, the criminal actors, what we could do in relation to those specific assets to hurt them financially, to limit their access to or recovery of or use of the funds that they had illegally obtained. So orders that confirm the status of crypto as property for securing or recovering property across global areas, I think, is very important to have that reciprocity across different countries, to allow for orders made in one country to be served in other countries. Asset or freezing orders, even if it's against unknown persons. The identity sometimes is often more difficult to fully put the pin on, despite the fact that we know where the assets are, we can see them, we can specifically identify them. So asset preservation orders, even absent a specific identity, I think is very important. And worldwide freezing orders to be able to lock funds or assets in place to prevent at least criminals or criminal elements from profiting from their crimes would be some examples of law enforcement tools that I think would be very valuable.
Jeremy, you touch on some forward-leaning issues there, and I'd love to address some of those. We can't ignore the growth and prominence of AI as it relates to distributed ledger technology. Do you all see an imminent or prominent role for AI in transaction monitoring and detecting illicit activity in the near future? Marina,
It's already happening. I think that's what I mean. At this point, if you're in finance and you're not using AI to some extent, then you're not. It's hard to be competitive in the digital age and the future of a digital economy if you're not leveraging things like automation and advanced pattern recognition and other capabilities that AI bring. And I think most blockchain analytics firms rely on artificial intelligence and machine learning. So that's already a key part of what's possible in this space. It's also possible in the non-crypto space. There's just so much information that's available on a public ledger that's very helpful to support clustering analytics that's supported by those firms. So I do think that AI certainly in compliance has been used for many years in the TradFi space and has been integrated in blockchain analytics, and I think it will continue to grow. And frankly, in the future, as you integrate more and more AI for both like licit and well-intentioned purposes, but that can still drive other sorts of risks, like to broader systemic stability and issues around like operational resilience and cybersecurity. I think that AIs are going to be the overwatchers and the supervisors of the use of AI in application in other ways. There's lots of challenges with that too, and issues around transparency and explainability and what the role of like human accountability and operation should be inside of that. But I think that AI, I mean, already we see that the automation part of AI tools are integrated in things like smart contracts. So I certainly feel that they've already demonstrated to be incredible tools in the compliance front and reg tech space. And I think that the only way that we can ensure that the future use of AI when applied to high risk, high value activities like finance is to make sure that we're leveraging the same level of best in class AI in order to ensure its transparency, its ethics, its responsible behavior.
Yeah, I don't think there's a better, right? AI requires data integrity and security, right? In order to function at its very base foundation. And there's no better source for that than what information blockchain in terms of that integrity can provide. From a law enforcement or investigative fraud prevention perspective, I think there's great uses for AI fraud detection of transaction analysts detecting patterns in behavior, enhancing integrity and trust, and also even developing the smart contracts on which these platforms are built on, using AI power to optimize smart contracts, to reduce errors, create efficiency, and allow them to handle more complex conditions, such as anomalies or pattern detection, of which fraud will fall into. I think it can be leveraged in very positive ways to strengthen systems as opposed to weaken.
Yeah, I think Carol and Jeremy mentioned absolutely like key points here. I'll just add one thing, speaking from a seat of someone who talks to compliance officers and investigators like every day. I just mentioned one thing: false positives. It's a nightmare already. It's a nightmare already for like any kind of virtual asset service provider, that you're spending so much time on that. And again, if we're going to see a growth in the transactions, which everyone expects to see more L2s, you're going to see enormous growth on the false positives as well. So I would be more radical, and I would say that the deployment of AI for particularly case triage is a critical question for survival, because otherwise, again, compliance cost will be prohibitive, for virtual asset service providers to operate and to survive. And beyond that, of course, we can see, and we're already experimenting a lot in that with Crystal, that identifying odd activity, which leads to early identification of rug pulls, of Ponzi schemes, of security attacks. That helps significantly with increased attribution, with the better behavioral patterns that can lead again to early decisions. And basically, I would say that especially AI can help companies to turn from, being dealing with the consequences of, crime that already has happened, to actually preventing that, or stepping very, very early when actually you can make a difference and you can change the course of the whole investigation, of the whole process.
Marina, you mentioned the false positives and how big of a drag on efficiency and utility that can be. What do you see as the genesis of a lot of that activity? Is it bad data, poor integration of the tool with your partners, or is it just the analysis in general? Just better analysis would help to identify what transactions are real illicit activity, which aren't, or the tools need to be improved? Like what can we get at there?
Yeah, as Jeremy mentioned, blockchain is it's a wealth of data. Like, you can have a lot of information there, and it's a question of how you label that, how you structure that, how you index this information, these data. And unfortunately, until very recent time, in blockchain analytics firms, it was like kind of a semi-manual process where you are looking at certain activity, at similar activity, and then you're running algorithms on top of that. Now with AI, technically, I can imagine a situation where actually blockchain analytics firms are going to be developing AI models, which then can be sold to law enforcement or supervisory bodies, which can be feeding data to these AI models trained on the synthetic data, and then actually, preserving actually the privacy of these data. So I'm speaking, of course, like a very distant maybe future, but I also thinking that these could be a solution to many problems that we are facing right now, and the answer would be actually the development and the deployment of the technology, rather than more laws, in my opinion. So we are yet to see that. However, I do understand and appreciate that we really need to act now, and that's a different question.
Yeah.
Please go ahead.
Yeah, I love the point that Marina just made, and I know, like, I've been in so many conversations for years where people even envision that, and industry wish that government could do like sanitized versions of algorithms, and that's the way that red flags get published now. It's not just written out red flags and typologies, it's machine readable detection mechanisms for illicit activity. I don't know how practically realistic that will be in the nearer term, but for the regulator providing it the other way around. But I appreciate people with big think ideas, and it's not that it's not technically possible. I think that will be more about legally what will be doable, and how you make sure privacy and et cetera are all preserved. One key issue that I did want to bring up, since I know it's been I feel that it's currently being litigated in an existing case, is issues around auditability and explainability of use of AI. Whether it's in blockchain analytics or more broadly, since AIs can leverage lots of different data sets. So looking at off-chain data and integrating them as well. I think that issue, whether related to blockchain compliance or any other kind of compliance, or not even compliance, but just being able to justify why certain decisions were made, and making sure that decisions were fair, that they were rightfully operating, that they weren't bias-driven, et cetera. Looking at the quality of data, et cetera, that you were training these models off of, those issues are going to become critical as based on the level of stake and like risk of the use of them. For example, using an AI-driven detection mechanism or clustering algorithm in a courtroom. I think that it will be really interesting to see what sorts of standards get driven or promoted by industry for what does good look like and rightful look like, and justifying every decision that's made by an AI, what the corroborating evidence needs to be, how you can share that kind of information without compromising intellectual property. All of those are really interesting issues that I think will end up needing to be resolved and are currently being considered already for using AI. So I just wanted to highlight those as some interesting issues that I think do come up when using AI for sensitive areas like this.
Well, on that issue, do you guys have a view on how homomorphic encryption and ZK proofs might play a role in some of those, data, ownership and privacy and transactions? Do you see that as something that's imminent that the industry can leverage and to solve some of these issues? Or is it still too far down the line to be effective?
I definitely see a lot of experience happening on that front, and it's interesting that they have come from the area of the traditional finance. And particularly, I was having some interesting conversations with some Swiss regulators explaining that the whole concept grew out of the idea that people needed to show the bank account without actually disclosing too much, and what was happening within this report. So yeah, and now it's again, ZK rollups were designed, and I was for preserving privacy, and I was like numerous times I was like a lot of people tried to convince me that these ZK rollups are going to be killing, blockchain analytics. I'm seeing the opposite happening, and a lot of experience on how, again, they can be preserving privacy for people who are using mixers, not because they're criminals, but because they are located in the country with a high level of corruption, and they don't trust local enforcement authorities, and they really need to take care about, again, keeping their digital assets intact and not known to anyone. So yeah, clearly that I think will help significantly, but I can see with AI the alternative path to that, the one that I described, that previously it's us talking to various law enforcement, talking to Europol people about how to identify a pattern for a drug dealer on looking just at his like transactions that are happening. And definitely if I can train investigators in my team right now to do that, then we can train AI to identify these with a very high level of probability and just save so much time, effort, and money. So we definitely should do that.
Yeah, and Marina, I think you bring up a point that's good, and how we get to the useful common middle ground. For example, with mixers, obviously bad actors have used those to launder funds and to go to some of enemies of the U.S. and its allies. But you brought up some great use cases where people in countries where they're corrupt governments or they're dissidents or wanting to transfer funds to vulnerable people in war-torn countries, or even want to protect your own finances. You don't want your neighbor or the bad guy down the street knowing you have X dollars or euros or whatever in your account, so they come and put a gun to your head until you provide them with the keys to your accounts online. So those are somewhere in the middle. We need to find a place to land that satisfies privacy and satisfies the need for protection of national security, economic security.
There's a distinction, Chris, that I think people get lost between privacy and anonymity. Privacy needs to be protected and an avenue for all the instances you listed, but anonymity in matters related to criminal activity, thankfully there are teams like Marina's and ours that can sift through those layers and use the analytics and the tools that she's referenced and she leads and we have at our disposal to be able to unveil that in.
That's a great point.
And they evolve over time. I must say that mixers were a big issue like a couple of years ago, 3 years ago. Do big criminals use mixers anymore? Jeremy sees that clearly as much as I do. Not much. Getting away from bridges, getting away through swaps, much, provides much more room to move. And again, speed is the essence for them. So I would say that they're also evolving. And mixers, we're going to see, probably the evolution of the mixers as well at some point. I don't know. Yeah, but that's the reality.
Well, we have a few minutes left. I'd love to hear sort of general thoughts that you guys have on moving forward through this year and the coming years. What do you see as the primary trends across the intersection of illicit finance and crypto? Are they AI, some of those issues we've talked about, crypto casinos, other techs that are emerging technologies that are kind of intertwining and overlapping with blockchain? Just where do you guys see the conversation and the needs arising over the coming months and years?
I'll throw one out, Chris, that is probably unexpected. We talk about this a lot from federal, international, global levels. One thing that I think is important is establishing token tokenized assets, digital assets, cryptocurrency as a more common, familiar, and integrated payment mechanism that will lead to recognition, awareness, comfort, understanding of what's a standard transaction, what's a rug pull, what's indications of criminal activity. And that can come from government, can come from law enforcement, but it really comes from individual use. And I know we're a long way off from retail use, but if we can get people more familiar with it and using it more, that I think is going to strengthen the roots, the foundation of the system. And the way we do that from a law enforcement and investigative perspective is through local law enforcement. 98% of law enforcement in this country is at the state, local, territorial, tribal level. That is a huge gap in terms of investigating and addressing and responding to these problems, because people don't want to touch it, because calling, federal agencies that have higher thresholds or a higher caseload, and there's a lack of familiarity of even who to call there. I think if we can get local law enforcement strengthened in this so that they're addressing the individual consumer victimizations here, those are the people who are talking to their elected representatives. Those are the people who are going to want to use this more often. Those are the people who are going to be more familiar with it. And harking back to my former days, and shout out to the Secret Service. The Secret Service runs the National Computer Forensics Institute that trains and equips local, state, local, territorial, tribal law enforcement. If we can strengthen at that level, I think the law enforcement apparatus as a whole gets stronger to protect the entire environment.
Thanks, Jeremy. And that's a really stark statistic that highlights that issue, that 98% of law enforcement takes place at state, local, and tribal levels. So that highlights it. Carol,
Yeah, I love those points from Jeremy, of course. I'd say that on trends for the illicit finance, I mean, we are seeing more illicit activity driven towards DeFi, which is a marker of a lot of things, including probably increasing compliance globally for the entities that at least acknowledge that they're more centralized institutions. There are plenty that are still not compliant internationally, but that doesn't mean it's a good marker of growing compliance in the space, but then also potentially scarier issues of it moving into DeFi and why you're seeing so much more policy on the Hill and in regulators' interest in DeFi. I'm hoping that what we'll see is international adoption at the application layer and exchange layer policy, so that we don't have to be so worried about the DeFi risk at the moment, just for a lot of reasons that are too long to get into right now. But honestly, I don't see a lot of evidence of very timely implementation. I'm hoping that with the new round of mutual evaluations for FATF restarting off this year, that will kick some countries into gear. And there is some emphasis on things like asset recovery that have been prioritized at the FATF that I'm hopeful for. But on illicit trends, I am worried about that increase. I'll also say that the increase in experimentation for privacy enhancing technologies, I do feel that the future of this space is not open, public, unobscured ledgers. It'll probably take a while for that adoption to happen, but for the transition to occur. But ultimately, I don't think that when you have very sophisticated AI and clustering capabilities that are open source, which is absolutely a nearer term future, that people will want these to be unobscured. So I think that privacy enhancements are the future in crypto, which means you potentially lose some of that capability of traceability and the benefit that you get from open ledgers. So there's a lot of risks that have to be considered there, and where I'm hoping that some of the technologies and experimentation that you and Marina spoke to will understand that it's not just about seeing what the tech can do, but ensuring that the right governance systems and frameworks for discoverability and disclosure are included. Some of the projects that she spoke about are referencing that and trying to figure it out. But it's that the future will not be anonymous free flow of cash cross border. So I think those are some of the things that I'm concerned about, but also believe that tech can absolutely evolve to meet the policy needs.
Carol, you're touching on issues that I know you brought up in the report that you were a lead author for in your role as the chair at the TAC committee and at the CFTC. I think we need another hour to go over unanswered questions and other things that we brought up. Marina, please, you give us the last word on your thoughts going forward. I know we just hit 2:30, but please share with us.
Yeah, sure. Well, yeah, that's true. DeFi and clarification about what DeFi should do. We see it right now that a lot of DeFi projects around the world are just sitting and waiting and telling us like we're not obliged to do anything because we're not called yet. And I'm like, and what's happening when you're going to be called? Like, it's just silly. Yeah, you should not sit and wait. That is for sure. So we are also anticipating that. But again, that would mean much more volume again of the observed and monitored transactions. But that means more data for us, which is obviously a very, very good thing. Along with DeFi, I would say these big narratives going from 2023 and 2024, which are big butchering and drainers, being a particularly like specific areas of crime based on human emotions, people who want to be loved and people who want to get immediate reward because they bought some weird tokens and they want to get airdrops, and they're clicking some link and immediately all their wallets are getting emptied. These are huge, of course, and they're always multi-jurisdictional. They're always like cross-border, and we're going to hear a lot, about these cases. I think in the upcoming years, I would say. In general, I would really love to see in the company in the territories under FATF some kind of shift to actually reward companies and virtual asset service providers that are doing things right from the compliance, that are collaborating, that are submitting enough information, that are supporting, again, going investigations. We don't see that much, happening. And I would love to see, again, this shift from, again, we had a lot of big cases, big media cases about how things can be done wrong. And I understand that we are, not lacking these cases in future. There are going to be, of course, a lot of those. But along with that, I really would love to see examples, of how things can be done right. And we need to really highlight this, and government should support these companies in doing things right. And I think it's a very important part.
Well, those are great points, and I appreciate all of your input and participation today. And for everybody who listened in and stayed past 2:30, I appreciate that as well. This was very informative. And like I said, I think we are going to need at least another hour to revisit and dig into some of these issues. So thank you all for participating. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you.